I am the Executive Director of the Northwestern Buffett Institute for Global Affairs. Welcome back to our webinar series, Confronting COVID-19 Global Implications and Futures. So over the past 6 months, as the COVID-19 outbreak became a worldwide pandemic, rival narratives have emerged in the ways that politicians and media pundits are speaking about security and borders and identity. But what do these new discourses about boundaries, whether they're physical boundaries or political boundaries or affective boundaries, mean for our understanding of identities and of geopolitics? What are the implications for the war of words between the US and China? To what extent is the pandemic changing the tides of global influence? How do we think about how the media and geopolitics have shaped and been shaped by COVID-19? So in other words, is globalization itself shifting as a result of this pandemic? Well, to talk about all this and more, I am just thrilled that we are joined today by Professor Marwan Kraidy. He is a scholar of global communication, a leading authority on Arab media, politics, and culture, an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, and the incoming Dean and CEO of Northwestern University-Qatar, NUQ. He's currently Professor of Communications and the Anthony Shadid Chair in Global Media, Politics, and Culture at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School of Communications, where he's also the founding director of the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication. And let me just say, on a more personal level, I first met Marwan a few months ago when he was considering whether or not to join us at Northwestern, and I walked into a windowless conference room and sat down across from this person. And after about 2 minutes of this conversation, I thought to myself, stop, this is just too good to be true. This is unbelievable. One doesn't find very often in this world someone as sophisticated, as creative, as adventurous from a scholarly point of view, who can't be pigeonholed in any particular discipline or area of the world, and also just such a wonderful leader. And so we're very, very, very excited about him joining us. Marwan studies the relationship between culture and geopolitics, theories of identity and modernity, and global media systems and industries. But what makes his work really distinctive is his reliance on theoretical grounding in multilingual literatures, obviously something near and dear to our heart at Buffett also, and a global and comparative approach that really spans historical periods, geographic sites, cultural forms, and media platforms. He has published 13 books and edited volumes, written 130 essays and chapters, and won more than 50 awards for his teaching and scholarship. In other words, he is the epitome of a global superstar. So we're just delighted to have Marwan with us today, and even more excited for all that is to come with his leadership at NUQ. So Marwan, welcome today, and of course, welcome to Northwestern. Over to you.
Annalise, thank you so much. You can't see it now on the WebEx, but I'm blushing right now. Thank you so much for your hospitality, for your support. That meeting that you just mentioned between the two of us was one of the things that really cinched the deal for me. So, so everything you said about me is reciprocated. And thank you also for inviting me to be part of this series. And I want to thank also Ariel, Ahmed, and Dylan for all their help with the technology. Here's what I'd like to do today. So, you know, as Annalise said, I study media, but within the context, the political, cultural context, comparatively and globally, is very important to me. And so I tend to apply what are broadly defined humanistic methods to my understanding of media. And so here's the perspective that I'm applying today. So as I'm speaking, we have now just around 8 million cases of COVID. The number of deaths is closing in on 500,000, and we have 3 million recoveries. We have faced all kinds of questions about the way we see the world. Like any major crisis, I think we have sort of histrionic media narratives about this is unique, this is unprecedented, this is distinctive. In many ways, I think the world has seen epidemics before. We've seen a lot of comparison to 1918. This is different and similar, and so I'd like to talk a little bit about what's special about this pandemic. And I'd like to organize my remarks in three themes. So the first one, I really want to connect this, the way that media narratives about COVID are circulating to the kind of political systems, not only the existing political systems, but the sort of the narratives, the rival narratives about, is dictatorship better equipped to handle a pandemic of this sort than democracy? There was a lot of rhetoric about this in the early days as the Chinese epidemic looked like it was under control and U.S. numbers began to spike. The notion was that, here, we have China, it's better equipped, not only because political power is centralized and decisions have to be executed without any questioning, but also because China had the system in place, the manufacturing system, the social system, the medical system, to build a field hospital of 10,000 beds in Wuhan almost overnight. China still manufactured masks, it manufactured respirators. All kinds of questions began arising about the nature of globalization. Why does the US not have the capacity to manufacture simple PPE, simple personal protective equipment like masks, like respirators? Soon, this evolved into a more direct narrative confrontation, partly because of some of President Trump's statements, including branding COVID-19, the Wuhan virus, the China virus, the Kung flu, like some people in his media orbit called it. And that, of course, elicited quite a robust response from China. The media productions that China has distributed, has circulated about the U.S. Is both poignant because it's partly true about the initial handling of the virus, but also it has become, we should not think of it only as U.S. versus China. Neither should we think of it in terms of perhaps presidential tantrums from the U.S. Last week, the European Union lodged an official complaint with China against what it called Chinese disinformation about the virus. And there seems to be an emerging consensus about having a global commission to understand, how it started and where it started. The problem with this kind of moment is that what people have called the infodemic, the proliferation, the circulation that's very fast at a very large scale of all kinds of conspiracy theories, of half-baked medical notions is new. We did not have this before, right? Even if you compare it with the SARS epidemic or pandemic, which never achieved the kind of global scale that this has, we do have a new media environment that is not only the official media and the media of record, so it's not just the sort of state media in parts of the world, and then official organs of public diplomacy, like Voice of America, for example, in the U.S., but it's also the social media sphere. Not only individuals, intellectuals, medical doctors, journalists giving their opinions on an individual basis, but we have the semi-official armies of trolls that belong or are affiliated with one or another government, with one or another political party, that are wreaking havoc over the kinds of information that is amplified and that ends up on people's phones, on people's computers, and on people's television screens. So this is one aspect. Now, this is accentuated by a very interesting factor. And again, here, I just want to emphasize, I am not speaking from, I have not conducted any recent empirical research about this. So this is sort of quote unquote open source information. I'm trying to synthesize a lot of things that I have observed. And in the debate about whether dictatorship or democracy, and of course, these are not ideal types, these are sort of general orientations of governments. We have a lot of hybrid governments today around the world. What is the political system a factor in how a country or how well a country handles the epidemic? So here's what I think we can say. even though we cannot answer this question fully. If we look now at the worst affected countries, at the countries where the number of cases is still climbing, where the number of deaths is still climbing and expected to climb further, the one thing they seem to have in common is that they have strong men as leaders. And the category of strong man, of course, I don't necessarily mean a full-on fascist dictator, but it's a leader in all these cases who has been elected, but who has shown some authoritarian tendencies. I'm thinking of the United States, I'm thinking of Brazil, I'm thinking of India, I'm thinking of the UK. These are cases where you have leaders, again, who have this sort of populist rhetoric, who have shown a disdain for science and for what medical professionals were saying, that ranges from musing on live television about whether drinking bleach could be helpful, or like the Brazilian leader did, coughing and sneezing in front of somebody on purpose during a rally to make a political point. And so those countries seem to be doing less well. Whether this is a coincidence or not is difficult to say, and will need a lot of empirical vindication. But I do think that there's something about this populist style of governance, this personalization of power in the leader's body, this disdain for science and for the medical professionals who may contradict the political agenda, because science, objective facts on the ground, have a way of getting in the way of political agendas that may not be fully coherent or consistent. We also have the sort of hypermediation of some women leaders as a contrast. The Prime Minister of New Zealand, the Chancellor of Germany, the Prime Minister of Iceland, who are very highly mediatized figures. Basically, the argument is when women in charge, things go better. Again, this is a very intriguing notion. This holds, I think Germany is the most interesting aspect, is the most interesting case. It's a large country that does have relatively open border, that has a new wave of refugees. Iceland and New Zealand is perhaps not fair. They're both small islands with high revenues, so you would think it's easy to control it. But that's another very intriguing thing that I think researchers should get to the bottom of. And not just leave it as sort of a media discourse hanging out there. The final issue under this dictatorship and democracy rubric that I want to approach is the notion of how mobile media have become a political or a hot potato in debates about surveillance that is necessary, according to its proponents, to be able to control COVID, particularly tracing apps, right? So we have several countries that have tracing apps. Some of them are talking about connecting tracing apps to biometric identity, documents. Qatar, the country where Northwestern University has a campus that I'm heading to in a few weeks, has a tracing app. I know from people who are there, they say a couple of things. Number one, they do feel their privacy is invaded, and some bugs have shown up, and the government and the telecom company that's helping out with this have fixed the app. But on the other hand, people say, I do feel my privacy has been invaded. On the other hand, it's amazing that if I went to a supermarket, if I went to Carrefour to buy my groceries yesterday, this morning I wake up and there's a text from the app that says, while you were at the supermarket, somebody else was there and has been confirmed positive. If you feel any symptoms, please get tested. In the meantime, be careful. And so there's this mix of fear of a further, deeper invasion of privacy that's going in tandem with the recognition that tracing apps do work, at least create more live information, so you don't have to wait days or longer to know what's going on. So that's going to be, I think, a challenge that falls under the rubric of sort of the digital in general. I think there's another issue which I find even more interesting than the first, and that's my second theme, The third was sort of the tug of war between autocratic system and democratic system and the way they handle the epidemic. The second one is the debate between, or the tension between, sort of a global solidarity movement on the one hand versus tendencies towards national retrenchment. One of the first things you see happening that I noticed when the pandemic started is how talk of borders suddenly emerged in full force. Now, talk about borders is not new, right? We've seen it in the US election of 2016. We've seen it in the debate about Brexit. We have countries around the world that are trying to build a clean internet. We have China's firewall. So this notion of having borders that protect your national identity, that protects prevalent values, is not new. But the way it shot up, it looked almost like those early days when the curve of cases in New York City going up. That's what I felt one evening. I was reading about the pandemic one evening in early April. And it was shocking to see how everywhere you looked, the press in several countries, talk of borders has become very dominant. Now, a lot of the time, anxieties about something new, something strange, something alien, something from the outside, manifest themselves in talk about border, in hyperactive discussions of border, right? One of the most interesting things, if you look at the German or the French press, for example, that's the core of the European Union. And in France and Germany, talk of closing borders between each other. We're not talking about, borders of the Schengen region or the borders of the EU, but between France and Germany has been a taboo topic for a while now. And leaders have had to grapple with this. Talk about, no, we do need to actually close these borders, which goes against the European project. So everywhere you went, there was this notion that the harder idea of sovereignty needs to prevail if we are to stop this virus. Now, this also manifested itself in sort of an increase in discussion of metaphors of invasion, right? Who among us has not heard about the murder hornets? Or here in southeastern Pennsylvania, it seems every week there's a new invasive species that we're supposed to destroy. I'm on an email list among the neighbors, and now we have a bug. It's a butterfly. It's supposedly an invasive species that's going to kill all the trees. So every day there are people exchange emails about how many I've killed. And so there's this discussion of everything seems to be invasive. I think this is very dangerous because this moves very easily from species of animals to other human beings with extremely dire consequences over time, right? When you talk about something being an invasion, once you start using the language like some people on the far right have used and are still using in the US and in Europe in particular, but everywhere else, in India, for example, even to some extent in Turkey and China, then the next level of discourse is to kill the other, is to exterminate the threat. And I think this is very dangerous, and this is an element of this COVID-19 pandemic that licenses opinion leaders to use this language that I think has very, very dangerous consequences. And that, of course, in the US, another manifestation of it is, it folds naturally into the governance, the rhetoric of governance of our current administration, where you first withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, then you blame the WHO for the pandemic, you withdraw from UNESCO. There are always threats towards any multilateral bodies, the International Court of Justice. This kind of national retrenchment is given a lot of fuel by a pandemic like COVID, where the natural reaction is to protect yourself from this virus that's coming from the outside, that's going to get into your skin and make you sick. And that easily becomes a metaphor for how you think about the nation, threatened by forces from the outside. And I do think this, in some quarters, is leading to a rethinking, a reconsideration of everything we thought we knew about globalization. Open borders has become a vernacular of weakness on the right, in the US and in Europe, mostly. The sort of free trade, again, has become almost anathema at a time when You have protectionism that's melding with this medical threat. And so I think in the years to come, we're going to have to grapple with changing not only understandings of these notions, but also changing feelings among key populations towards ideas, but also actions connected with a global society. The third dimension, and I will end with this, is what I call the transnational dimension. And this is where we have some very, very important issues that have been with us for years. Again, they're not new, but they've been given not only a new lease on life, but a new kind of intensity and a new kind of public scrutiny. And of course, one of the bigger things right now is the protests for racial justice going on, not only in the US, but also around the world. And here I think there's something very, very important that needs to be said. So one of the ways in which the US has been addressed, and of course, one of the dominant readings that's going to come out of the pandemic, I think, is the declinist discourse about the US being a declining force, that the US has reached its apex of power during the invasion of Iraq or with the invasion of Iraq, and that's when the real decline started. Of course, we have demographers and historians that have been saying decline started earlier, but I think we see an acceleration of this with the Trump administration, with the absence of the US from the table that is discussing the worldwide response to COVID, with the withdrawal from the US from all these international organizations. But here's what I want to emphasize. A very important point to be made is that United States-based activists for social justice and equality are leading the way, are leading the world in the places where the US leadership, the US government has failed to lead the world. One of the most interesting things about the murder of George Floyd is the way that it triggered not only a full awakening about injustice and inequality in the US, but it has triggered global actions all over the world that, of course, focus on race and raise the signal, the banners of Black Lives Matter from Berlin to Beirut, in Vienna, in some of the most unlikely of places, in Paris and Tokyo. There's been demonstrations profoundly, directly focused on Black Lives Matter, but of course, the issues that come out are local issues, right? That basically the resonance of the killing of a Black man by a policeman's knee in Minneapolis, of course, is itself a very compelling, a very graphic insignia of the kind of violence, racial violence that's inflicted on minorities in the US. But of course, in places like Beirut, in places like Berlin, it resonates with local issues. It resonates with anti-immigrant discourse. It resonates with sectarianism. It resonates with the kind of experience that some people, for example, in the Middle East have with US military force, right? And what that gives rise to, of course, is if you look at the toppling of statues, you begin with Frank Rizzo in Philadelphia, a police chief who's known for his racism. His statue is toppled. Then you end up with Winston Churchill and Christopher Columbus, right? Not exactly figures of central importance in the contemporary struggle for social justice and racial justice in the United States. These are figures connected with historical imperialism and colonialism. And here's why I said that US activists are leading the way, awakening, sort of reviving the embers into flames of all the anti-colonial, anti-violence, anti-repression struggles all over the world, whether they're against local dictators or against the memory and history of imperialism and colonialism. And I think this is something that we haven't focused enough on because we've been too busy saying US leadership is in decline. I think this is one aspect of it where it's not in decline, right? The other thing of the other part of this transnational dimension I want to mention, and this is something that's popping up in columns. I read a Spanish journalist, a blogger. I've read stuff from Lebanon, from Mexico about this, but particularly from countries that have recently dealt with the US military presence, particularly Iraq, that basically say that people should see the connection when you see police and National Guard in downtown Philadelphia dressed like they are in Fallujah, dressed for full battle in full gear. You realize that the militarization of the U.S. police is connected to counterinsurgency tactics that the U.S. has applied overseas, right? So we have this connection between, of course, the U.S. has a unique history of the legacy of slavery, of racial injustice, but this is becoming more connected with other people around the world who see themselves in these struggles and who look at the U.S. not necessarily as a model, as a country, but who are looking at resonating with U.S. activist movements, which is of course helped by hashtags and social media and all that. Now, the last thing I would like to say about this is that it is no surprise that the resonance of the protests in U.S. cities that have basically people were stuck at home for 3 months, taking in all these images of disease and death and then atrocity. A black man cannot jog without getting shot. A black man walking around the street ends up with the knee of a cop on his neck. These are very, very powerful images. I'm finishing a book about ISIS, and I call the images that it unleashes on the world projectilic. These are images that act like bullets, that act like arrows. These are images that hurt us very deeply. They're the psychological equivalent of a bullet penetrating your body. These are the kind of images we're seeing now from US streets. And we see a lot of protests, again, being met by more and more violence. But we also see the same phenomenon happening, whether it's anti-Blackness in Brazil, Islamophobia in India, that's fueling the violence of the state apparatus against these protesters. I do believe the anger is such, the level of organization is at a level where these are long, protracted movements. This is not going to be, this is not going to disappear from the news cycle. And I hope that in our own academic institutions, we can contribute to making measures to redress not just anti-Blackness, but racial inequalities and inequality and social justice in general, have more long-term sustainable solutions as opposed to solutions that are focused on the short term that tend to be almost cosmetic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, Marwan, that was, you've given us so much to talk about. Thank you so much. I have so many questions. I know others do too. If you have a question, by the way, please post it in the chat, and I will collate those and ask them to Marwan. Maybe to start, I'd like to start just where you ended with images. So you're right that somehow this seems to be about the global circulation of images mediated by technology, and we know a lot about that, Benjamin and so on, that there's a lot of power in that, and that there's a lot of complexity, and that images can be read in different ways. I guess what's so interesting to me is that at this moment of, you say, borders and people refusing to empathize with others, there's also tremendous empathy right now and curiosity brought about by those images, a sense that that could be me, or I can imagine what it's like to be in that situation. I can imagine what it's like to be in Fallujah now that I've seen those troops on our streets. Can you give us any tools for thinking in a more subtle and sophisticated and critical way about what these images are doing to us, how they're changing us, how they can have these contradictions, both encourage us to be more fearful of invasion, as you say, and more open and interested in solidarity with others. It's very hard for me to make sense of, so I turn to you.
So I think, this is a very difficult question to answer, because ideally what we would have is we would have the kind of literacy that we need to have in the digital age, right? there are ways in which you can interpret images that is thoughtful, that basically look at the image before you share it. That's a very important issue. The problem with this is that the way we see at images, there are two problems. One is that images tend to be snippets of longer, larger, more elaborate media forms, right? So you see the 1 minute of a man choking, and you often don't see the context of what preceded this and what happened after that. That's one. Two, there's the sheer repetition, whether it's on cable news or on social media, where you may have a 20-minute video, but a 30-second clip is going to dominate the conversation. And I think the only way, and I know it sounds so academic to say this, but that's fine, because I think the general public could learn about the importance of context, right? Put things into context, number one. Number two, sadly, a picture that's tragic and hurtful to you and me is used as a means to celebrate, becomes a meme of joy in other circles. And again, that's a problem with the ability of digital tools to cull a tiny snippet out of a longer narrative and manipulate it to fit your own needs.
Annalise?
Yes? Ariel?
Oh, you were just on mute. It's fine.
Okay. On that point, Marwan, I mean, one of the things that I value so much about your work is that you are such a deep and broad reader of media in so many places in the world, including throughout the global South, not just in the sort of global North and the sort of traditional places where most of us get our media. So could you talk at all about how these issues are looking different in some of the places you're reading, how the images circulate differently in the global South, for example, than in the global North?
So, images circulate depending on a couple of things. Number one, you have the sort of the sheer technical availability of infrastructure, right? And so we still have places where that is not the case. Now, in most cities that, for example, if you look at the way that images are, these images are interpreted, let's say the Arab press, right? Or the French press, for example. One of the things you see is that they're immediately taken as a fodder to criticize U.S. foreign policy, right? So, for example, here, when we see Mr. Floyd agonizing on video, we don't think of this as an issue of foreign policy. We think of this as an issue of racial justice, systemic racism. If you look at how the press in Iraq or in Lebanon, or in Spain for that matter, has interpreted these, immediately it's about, this is what the U.S. does to people it doesn't agree with. So there's a shifting of frames from a domestic issue to a global issue. There's also the notion that, and this is related to it, the resentment worldwide, sometimes justified, sometimes very opportunistic, of trying to avoid being lectured about human rights by not just the U.S. but the West in general. That now has disappeared, right? Because the Trump administration has done everything but that. And so this would have usually been the frame. So I find it very interesting that the shift now is from a shift of social justice to foreign policy. So for a lot of people around the world, this is a geopolitical issue, not just an issue of racial justice.
Very interesting. So one of the participants asked whether you think that these images are in rapid fire and the speed with which they come at us is going to cause these movements to sort of burn out too fast, or whether there's a way to make the social movement sustainable, despite the fact that we're becoming desensitized to the rapid fire of these images.
When the debate started with the Arab Spring a decade ago, it feels like a century ago, about the role of social media and helping movements, there was a split between those who focused on technology, who focused on social media, and those who focused on the...
About all this and more, I am just
social media. In the years since then, the consensus seems to be, and a lot of my colleagues in communication and science and technology studies have written about this, that social media are very good for mobilizing movements, but they're not great for turning the initial energy of social movements into institutions that are durable. And I think the challenge now is to turn this energy on the streets, this energy on people's social media feed, into actual institutional power, into institutional structures. And I am optimistic about this, because I think the conversation has reached an amplitude that a lot of institutions, yes, we see all these corporate statements about diversity and equity, but I think the situation is such that people can no longer afford to just hide behind words. There is a very pressing series of demands for action. So I am optimistic that the social movement will endure and will spawn institutional power that make its goals actually achievable, even if it takes years.
Interesting. We have a number of people who are interested in your thoughts about the impact of all this on the future of capitalism. So right now we're having a lot of conversation about race, about human rights. What do you think the impact will be on the sort of what we associate in the US with the Bernie Sanders rhetoric of anti-capitalism and so forth?
Well, one of the things that, so first of all, I am one of those who does believe that capitalism and race are not separable, right? Now, sometimes we make them too much together, but they've always been linked. So moving to capitalism does not mean saying race no longer matters. Capitalism was fed by the bodies and the sweat of people working in plantation and oil fields, right? So we know the history. We don't need to go over it too often. I think the problem now is that by shining a light on the chasm of inequalities that we have in the richest country in the world, I think there's a general understanding that capitalism, that's often euphemized as globalization, right? Globalization is often used as a euphemism for capitalism. Not only has some losers, but does not work very well for a number of people who may now be the majority. Because before this year, if you heard, there are the losers, right? There are the losers of globalization. People who don't have a high school degree, who don't have a college degree, people concentrated in certain enclaves. So I think there are questions. The fact that Piketty's book took fire the way it did tells you that people do care about inequality. I think that will be aided by the pandemic, because again, the globalization of trade, of the world economy is seen as contributing to the spread of the virus. So that may shift people, fear of the virus may shift people's attitude, at least temporarily, in ways that ideology or a commitment to equality would not. That would be very interesting to see.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So maybe on that point, so very interesting and I think very challenging question about leadership. So one of the interesting things about this movement is it's sort of leaderless in the traditional way and mediated by media technologies. And we've seen a lot of, you talked about the strongmen, the damage done by poor leadership. So how do we begin to think about what leadership looks like at this moment? What would you say to that?
So I think, look, I'm not on board with the celebration, the leaderlessness of movements, right? Because of movement, that it's very important at some level for movements to emerge from the grassroots to be true popular mobilizations. But when that lasts for too long, energy fizzles out. You do need leadership that's as representative as possible to negotiate with the opponent, to negotiate with the powers that be, to maybe extract some concessions, right? As long as activism is about saying what we don't want, you don't achieve this change. And I think very important aspect, perhaps the most fundamental aspect of leadership, is to translate these kinds of critical political energy into actual political demands. the sort of here's what we are against, but here's what we want. And the here's what we want, I think, is where a lot of social movements have failed, right? And unfortunately, there aren't many avenues to achieve this. I do think these movements need to translate some of their energies into electoral politics, at least at the local level, you know, with police, with city council, to make any difference, right? What Nancy Fraser talks, the move from weak publics to strong publics, to publics that actually run institutions, political institutions. I think that's a fundamental role that leadership has to play right now.
So translating what we don't want to what we want, that sounds like a job for intellectuals to some extent, right? Is there a new role for people like us? And how should we be imagining our role in all this? The universities, the intellectuals, the students.
You know, I think in many ways, universities are one of the few remaining places where free inquiry is, even if it's officially embraced, sometimes in effect it's tolerated, right? So I think that's a fundamental aspect. I wish more of us could be the sort of the ideal of, you know, Gramsci's organic intellectual. I think the way it works, it's very difficult, but I do think there's a lot of space for what I would call empirical research into activist claims, right? That, in other words, we know this from healthcare. We know this from the people who are doing great work on hunger among college students. We know this from people who are talking about inclusion and diversity, not just being the right things to do, but being the good things to do in terms of efficiency, in terms of achieving better outcomes, all that stuff, right? And so I think, yes, we have a huge role to play. The problem is that, as you know, we're torn between a variety of roles, right? And I don't want to say that every single grad student who's finishing a PhD or every single new assistant professor should be sort of a public intellectual overnight, but I think it's important to create spaces for some of us to do that work.
And so along those lines, I have a question perhaps from one of your future colleagues at NUQ saying that, yes, but does higher education need to be decolonized? And do you have plans specifically to decolonize the higher education curriculum at NUQ? I don't know.
So if by decolonize, you mean including voices that have been shut out completely from the conversation, absolutely. And you know, in my own syllabi, if you look at my own syllabi, I always include what I call the unusual suspects. The people who have written about a topic. If you organize education according to themes and debates within themes, you absolutely have, it's your moral and pedagogical responsibility to include every single perspective, in particular the perspectives that do not have a microphone, do not have a platform about those issues, right? And so, yes, the short answer is yes. How to do that is very complicated because different people, if you believe in faculty governance, as I do, different people have very different ideas what it means to decolonize the curriculum, right? But that's a debate that's absolutely worth having.
Conversation among participants. So another question, is there a role for breaking down the walls of the university, moving beyond and engaging voices or movements or people outside the academy in the pedagogical or critical intellectual project? And also related to that, another question, is there a role for using new media technologies, video, the kinds of things you've been talking about in your talk, including distance technologies to decolonize and become allies of change?
So the sort of the obvious, easy answer to these is yes and yes. The more complicated is how to get there, right? I think to begin with the last question, this is an issue facing all of us. I think the digital delivery of education of course, offers a lot of opportunities, but I think it offers challenges that people have not thought through fully yet. One of them is the erasure of place. So what happens if you have an institution in a country where students go and pay what college students pay these days and have to have transportation and all that, and suddenly you have a prestigious university in the US that says, hey, we can give you this degree online, right? Why it can wreak havoc, and nobody knows how this is going to work. So I think one of the interesting things about this, that I see this as militating in favor of a broader diversity of voices, is place, because it risks being erased, is going to matter more. So context will matter more, right? So you could do a course, you could study reporting at this institution, but if you want to study a specific kind of crisis, it's perhaps better to study it where it is occurring, right? So China could be a great place to look at what happens at the tension between fast economic growth on a very large scale and environmental degradation, if that's what you're interested, right? So I think in many ways we haven't thought about what all of that means yet. But I don't see this as a yes, it's great, or no, it's terrible. I think it's a much more complicated way of sifting through what opportunities there are, neutralizing the challenges, and trying to nurture the opportunities.
Some critical tools too. I imagine that Benjamin et al. Is probably not going to cut it. We probably need more. But in any case, another question is about religion. So you haven't talked about global religion. How do you see that as inflecting and affecting everything we've been talking about?
I mean, religion, unfortunately, in many ways, religion these days has become a tool of polarization, right? It's very difficult to have kind of deployments of religion for the common good. A lot of people have been doing it. I mean, I've seen, I'm looking much more closely about what's happening in the Gulf now because I'm moving to Qatar soon, for example. I've seen a lot of religious leaders say that find religious vindication for why you should respect social distance, for example, and care for the other because it's not about you, right? The flip of getting the virus is not about you. It's about those you can infect. It's your body as a vector, right? So I thought that was interesting. Of course, there's a lot of interfaith initiatives and all that, but I do fear, I'm finishing a book about ISIS, right? And I see the sort of, there's a petition now that has around 40,000 signatures in the US to declare the Ku Klux Klan a terrorist organization. Well, these are two organizations that speak in many ways in the name of religion, right? So to answer the role of religion has a multiplicity of roles, and these roles as diverse as the human ability to deploy religion for the common good or to subvert it and manipulate it for their own purposes. It's something that's very difficult to speak about in generalities, I think.
That's so interesting. So are you suggesting that answering a movement that speaks in the language of religion with the language of international law, i.e. terrorism, which is an inadequate response, that these are two different modalities of social organization or something, or is that not what you're saying? Yeah.
That's not exactly what I'm saying. What I am saying, but I mean, this is true, right? That sometimes, parsing out to what extent an organization that speaks in the name of religion is actually understood and accepted on religious grounds by its followers is a very difficult thing to do, particularly when you're dealing with organizations that are brutal, that are clandestine, that are, even as a researcher, you don't want to Skype with one of them because you get in a load of trouble, right? But I do think I am arguing for a much more granular understanding of religion and context. Just to religion and race are very intricately connected. Religion and identity are very connected. Religion and war obviously are connected, right? So I can't, basically, I'm blabbering on to say that I cannot answer a question about the role of religion at large.
Yeah.
That's very difficult.
That makes sense. So let's switch then to an equally large and impossible topic, which is science. So, one of our participants is interested in the way in which the WHO and COVID science and so forth has been so politicized. You know, whether you wear a mask or not is associated with a particular political point of view. To what extent that politicalization of science is itself an effect of the media technologies you're describing, but also what do you do about it as a strategy if you're a scientist? Do you try to become neutral? Do you admit that that you yourself have a particular point of view? You're not objective, and what would you recommend as a media strategy?
So one of the things that's very important, and some of my colleagues at the Annenberg School are working on, is the importance of science communication. Why is it important? So what brought home to me why this is such an important issue is the snafu over masks in the U.S.
Yeah.
So if you look at what we've heard about masks,
yeah.
First it was, no, they do nothing. Then it, like, you have to wear them. Then it becomes a political issue with many different subtexts, right? One of them is it hides the face. Another one, you rebreathe CO2. So I think in many ways, government has a huge responsibility. Science does not operate in a vacuum. And scientific results need to be communicated in an environment that's very challenging. It's challenging, number one, because of the news cycle. You know, scientific results about a new health challenge trickle in. They don't just show up. And they're always tentative. And yet, because of the news cycle, because you have to have something new to say every 15 minutes, every small advance can be either trumpeted as a huge success by some media, which then gives other kinds of media license to criticize it as an exaggeration. So people, when they receive the next wave of news, they don't know what to make of it, right? And it's very difficult in a political environment where the people in charge are hostile to science. I cannot answer the question whether it's better to say what you're doing is completely wrong, I want to have nothing to do with it, or whether to make some concessions, however painful they are, to stay relatively close to the political system, right? But the communication of results of what surfaces the virus clings to, whether you should wear a mask, whether this medicine. I mean, think about it. We have a U.S. president who became enamored with the theories of a famous French medical professor in Marseille, trumpeting what he advocates as cure, while people in the FDA were saying, wait a second, this does not work, but this can actually cause problems, right? So it's a very difficult environment for scientists. I don't envy their situation.
And so maybe we can end here. The last question we have is on exactly this point. So what about the other side, the consumers of news? How do we train people to be more sophisticated, more sensitive consumers of the complexities? And in particular, how do you plan to think about that in the context of the Middle East and on our campus in Qatar?
You know, I would almost advocate a sort of digital media literacy test, perhaps something like the driver's license. I mean, we know now that people fooling around with an app on their cell phone can animate the rage of groups of people that can lead to actual death, right? So we know that. And yet, you sign up. Just that you buy the phone, you sign up. So to me, the challenge is, how do you make society understand the importance of these kinds of literacy skills? And can we turn that into a policy? Can we really, how do you teach population how to use social media in ways that you teach them how to use a car, right? Why is it that in some cases you need hours of training and tests, and in other you just sign up, right? That, I think, is something, I know it's a huge political battle to even introduce that to the conversation, but I think it's an idea worth having.
Absolutely. Very interesting. Well, Marwan, let me say these are very interesting ideas, but they're also the themes for projects, which we actually can pursue. And I'm so excited to think with you about what we can do through Northwestern's 2 campuses to work together. So thank you very much for sharing all this with us. And you've certainly given us more than we could ever hope for to think with. So very, very grateful to you for that. Thank you also to everyone who's joined us today. Our next webinar will be next Tuesday, same time, same place, 12 o'clock Central, June 23rd. We will host Feinberg School of Medicine faculty member, faculty members too, Dr. Lisa Hirschhorn and Dr. Mark Huffman, and they're going to be in conversation about primary healthcare resilience amid global pandemics based on the work that they do all over the world. So that should be quite interesting. They'll be joined by their colleague and collaborator, Dr. Anthony Orji, who's based at the University of Abuja Teaching Hospital in Nigeria. So very interesting. Sign in next week. In the meantime, thanks again, Marwan. Good luck with your move.
Thank you.
Stay in touch and let us know what we can do. And to all of you watching, thank you. Be well. Stay healthy. See you next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you. Bye.